They never told you the truth about Sleepy Hollow. They dressed it up as folklore, a simple ghost story for children, a tale to whisper by the fire when the nights grew long. But behind the fiction, behind Irving's polished words of 1820 lies something much darker, a history they buried, a curse that was real, a shadow that never left that valley. Imagine it, a place so drenched in silence, even the wind seemed afraid to move. Men walked with heads bowed, not out of humility, but fear of something that owned the night. They spoke of it as myth. But when farmers found livestock drained of blood, when grave diggers swore they heard hoofbeats echoing inside the earth, when children whispered of a faceless rider watching from the trees, the people of that valley knew myth had turned into something else. The headless horseman was not entertainment. It was a mask, a convenient disguise for something older, something imported from across the ocean. Ancient Germanic rituals, Celtic curses, the lore of the wild hunt, all transplanted into the soil of a young America. And the soil received it. The land absorbed it. Sleepy Hollow became more than a place. It became a portal. Washington Irving, the man who wrote it all down, was not merely an author. He was a collector of secrets, a man trained in the hidden arts of symbolism. Every word he crafted carried double meaning. Every shadow in his story pointed to a truth so vile the public could never be allowed to face it head-on. So he gave you a story that seemed harmless enough. But the danger was in what he left unsaid. What you were never told is this. The curse of Sleepy Hollow was not a ghost chasing men through the woods. It was a system of control. Fear became a weapon. Mystery became a leash. And through that leash, men became obedient, predictable, hollow. The tale you think you know was never about the rider. It was about you, about how easily a population can be guided, enslaved, and silenced under the weight of an invisible terror. This is the secret buried in the hollow, and tonight you're going to hear what they never wanted you to know. When you peel away the storybook layers, you realize Sleepy Hollow was never just about a ghostly rider. It was about memory. The valley was haunted, not by a man without a head, but by what men had done there, what they carried in silence. Blood remembers, soil remembers, and Sleepy Hollow carried within it a wound that refused to close. Before Irving ever dipped his pen in ink, that land had been marked by war. The Revolutionary War was not simply freedom versus tyranny. It was neighbor against neighbor, brother against brother. That valley was split down the center. Patriots on one side, loyalists on the other. Families torn apart. Executions at dawn. Heads taken as trophies. Pikes planted in the soil as warnings. You won't find that in the school books. But the hollow was littered with skulls before the legend was even written. The so-called headless horseman was said to be a Hessian soldier, a mercenary from Germany who fought for the British. A man cut down in battle, his head blasted away by a cannon. That's the version you've been told. But ask yourself, why did that one nameless soldier become a symbol that refused to die? Why did he haunt that land when thousands of others perished? The answer is unsettling, because his story was not an accident. It was constructed, a chosen myth planted like a seed. The Hessians brought more than weapons with them. They brought their rites, their folklore, their unspoken knowledge. Old-world legends of spectral riders, of hunters who roamed the night collecting souls, of gods who demanded offerings of fear and blood. The colonists may have mocked those stories in daylight, but at night they bent to them. They believed, and belief is the first chain. What makes a curse powerful is not the spirit itself, but the minds who submit to it. Fear turns whispers into law. And once the tale of the horseman began to spread, Sleepy Hollow was no longer free. Men walked differently. Women hushed their children. The valley grew obedient to a myth. What began as war became something else, a psychological conquest. And once fear colonizes the mind, you no longer need chains or armies to control a people. You only need a story. That story still lingers. Not in books, but in you. The same. Systems of control that enslaved the Hollow still operate today, just wearing different masks. You see, most men believe curses are supernatural. A phantom, a spell, a ghost clinging to the night. But the real curse of Sleepy Hollow wasn't spiritual, it was psychological. The rider without a head was a mirror, a symbol of what every man in that valley feared most, being reduced to nothing, stripped of identity, robbed of self. A body without a mind, a voice silenced forever. Understand this. In war, men aren't simply killed. They are erased, heads on pikes, skulls smashed into the earth. Those were messages. To sever the head is to sever memory, to kill more than the flesh. It is to erase the very identity of a man. The people of Sleepy Hollow didn't just fear the rider. They feared becoming him, forgotten, headless. A cautionary tale for all who defy the system. Washington Irving wrapped this horror in fiction, but he wasn't writing out of imagination alone. He understood how fear shapes obedience. He knew that to control the future, you must manipulate the past. By turning the valley's history of blood and betrayal into a ghost story, he disguised the true crime. Psychological warfare. You think you're reading a tale. In reality, you're reading the blueprint of control. But let's ask a forbidden question. Why was the rider headless? Why that detail? It was not chosen by chance. In ancient Germanic and Celtic rites, the head was considered the seat of the soul, the throne of power. Warriors kept skulls as talismans. Kings were crowned only after the ritual decapitation of their enemies. A body without a head is a man stripped of sovereignty. It is not just death, it is domination. So the curse of Sleepy Hollow was not the haunting of one soldier. It was the haunting of an idea that men could be reduced to shadows, their power stolen, their memory rewritten. That the living could be ruled not by chains, but by myths. And here's the most dangerous truth of all. The system hasn't changed. They don't need to ride through the night anymore. They've found new ways to take your head. Today it's not a sword or a cannonball. It's distraction, addiction, propaganda, different weapons, same war. The curse never left. It only evolved. The question is, have you noticed? Or are you already living headless, a ghost in someone else's story? Fear alone doesn't last. To make it permanent, it must be institutionalized. And that's exactly what happened in Sleepy Hollow. The ghost story was not just told around fireplaces. It was enforced, repeated, and cemented into culture by the very institutions meant to protect the people. The churches spoke of the rider as a warning. Step outside the faith, and darkness would claim you. They knew the valley's people were already trembling, so they turned the trembling into tithes. Sermons laced with shadows, whispers of judgment. The reminder that Satan himself roamed the forests. Convenient, isn't it? Fear of damnation is far more profitable when it wears the mask of a local legend. The schools. They didn't teach history as it was. They rewrote it. Children were fed fragments, half-truths, and warnings. The loyalist and patriot executions faded into silence. The war crimes disappeared. But the rider remained. He was retold, reshaped, drilled into the young minds of the Hollow until they no longer asked about their ancestors' betrayals. They only feared the dark. That's what a curse really is. A story strong enough to erase all others. And the government? They never needed to step in directly. They let the myth do the work. Control the population through fear. And you don't need soldiers patrolling every street. Sleepy Hollow became a model, how a tale could replace shackles, how men could be ruled not by law but by imagination. When the people police themselves out of fear, the rulers can rest easy. Do you see it now? The headless horseman wasn't just a phantom, it was a psychological control system wrapped in folklore. Every institution played its role, weaving the myth deeper into the minds of the people until it became inseparable from reality. And once fear becomes tradition, no one dares to question it. Fathers pass it to sons, teachers pass it to students. Priests lace it into scripture. Fear becomes faith, and here's the part they will never admit. Sleepy Hollow was not an exception. It was a template. The same formula was exported, scaled, and used across the young nation. Legends and ghost stories weren't simply campfire entertainment. They were tools, instruments of obedience, myths designed to hold men in line while the powerful carved their empires. The rider's shadow didn't just haunt the hollow. It haunts the entire structure you live under now. Washington Irving was no innocent storyteller. He wasn't simply recording folklore. He was embedding symbols, encoding truths in plain sight. Men like Irving understood something most people never will. Stories are vessels. They carry power. And if you know how to construct them, you can guide entire nations without ever lifting a sword. Look carefully at the legend of Sleepy Hollow. On the surface, it's comedy, even satire. Ichabod Crane, the awkward schoolmaster, outwitted and humiliated by superstition. But beneath the humor lies a framework of occult symbols, the kind only a trained eye can see. Irving wrote for the masses, yes, but he also wrote for the initiated. Take the horseman himself. A decapitated rider is not random. It is the archetype of the wild hunt, an ancient European myth of spectral riders who pursued souls at night. In Norse and Germanic traditions, the leader of the hunt was Odin, the god who sacrificed himself for hidden knowledge, often depicted with a steed and surrounded by spirits. By choosing a Hessian soldier as the ghost, Irving linked the hollow to this ancient European current. He wasn't creating a legend, he was reactivating one. Then look at Ichabod Crane, the man who falls victim to the tale. He is the intellectual, the educated, the rationalist who thinks he's above superstition. And yet he is the one undone. What's the hidden message? That even the learned man can be conquered by fear. That intellect is no defense against myth. A warning quietly slipped into the mind of every reader. Do not question too deeply. Do not rise above the story, or you will be destroyed by it. And what of the hollow itself? Irving describes it as bewitched, steeped in dreamlike silence, a place where reality bends. That description matches not only folklore but also the ancient idea of liminal spaces, territories between worlds where rules weaken and spirits reign. In occult traditions, such landscapes are not passive. They are chosen. They are cultivated as places where rituals can be performed, where memory and energy can be harvested. So when Irving gave you Sleepy Hollow, he wasn't merely entertaining you. He was binding you to an older current of fear and obedience, wrapping it in humor so you wouldn't resist. This is the brilliance of hidden power. It doesn't force itself on you. It seduces you. It disguises itself until you repeat it willingly. Until you become its vessel, the story is the curse. And once you've heard it, it never leaves you. Sleepy Hollow was never meant to remain an isolated legend. Once the formula was proven effective, fear as leash, myth as law, it was replicated, whispered, twisted, and seeded across the American landscape until entire regions lived beneath invisible chains. What you think of as American folklore was often nothing more than psychological engineering. Look at Salem. You're told the witch trials were hysteria, religious zealotry gone too far. But step closer, they were rehearsals, A community shattered by fear, neighbors turning on one another, children indoctrinated to see demons in the eyes of their own mothers. Salem was not simply about witches, it was about obedience. If fear of the supernatural can make you betray your own blood, then fear works better than any militia or travel south into Appalachia. Tales of ghostly women wandering the woods, phantom lights luring travelers to their doom, spectral animals haunting crossroads. Were these stories organic, or were they carefully shaped tools to keep isolated populations controlled, too afraid to travel, too suspicious to unite? Divide men with superstition, and they will never question the hand above them. Even on the frontier, fear was cultivated. Settlers spoke of native curses, spirits guarding the land, phantom riders who struck down men who trespassed. Convenient, isn't it? Tales like these turned hesitation into paralysis, keeping populations obedient to church and state rather than rising against them. Fear justified conquest. Fear justified obedience. Do you see the pattern? Sleepy Hollow was a seed. Salem, Appalachia, the frontier, branches of the same tree. Stories whispered in fear, amplified by pulpits, taught as tradition, carried through generations until they became unshakable truth. The curse wasn't in the supernatural. It was in the repetition. Say a thing often enough, and it becomes reality. And here is the dangerous secret. Once fear becomes tradition, it no longer needs masters to enforce it. Fathers tell sons, mothers warn daughters. Whole bloodlines become the enforcers of their own chains. The elite no longer have to ride through the night with swords drawn. The people cage themselves with stories, keeping the system alive voluntarily. The rider of Sleepy Hollow was just the prototype. America itself became the hollow. A nation guided by fear, haunted by myths, its people obedient to shadows they never dared to question. And if you think those shadows are gone, you are still asleep. The headless rider was more than a ghost. It was an initiation symbol. In ancient rites across Europe, Africa, even Asia, young men were forced to endure a ritual death before they could be reborn as warriors, priests, or servants of power. The severed head was not just a warning, it was a passage. Think about it. What does it mean to be headless? It means you no longer think for yourself. Your past, your doubts, your sovereignty, all gone. You become a vessel, a body without a mind, ready to be reshaped by the authority who holds the head. That's how initiations work. Strip a man of identity, drown him in terror, force him to confront death, then rebuild him in the image of the system. The rider without a head was not the threat. He was the example, a figure who said, "This is what you will become if you resist. This is what you will become if you enter the mystery unprepared." In every corner of history, the same symbol repeats. Knights of old swore loyalty only after, enduring rituals of mock death. Secret societies demanded silence under pain of losing one's head. Even monarchies displayed severed heads on spikes to teach the masses what happens when identity stands against authority. Washington Irving knew these layers. He dressed them as fiction, but he encoded an ancient truth. Fear is the initiator. Terror is the teacher. And those who survive its grip emerge remade, not as free men, but as obedient vessels. Sleepy Hollow was not just a cursed valley. It was an initiation ground, a place where myth broke men down and rebuilt them as shadows of themselves. And here's where the noose tightens. This process never ended. You've been through it too, whether you realized it or not. Modern life is built to strip your head. The endless distractions, the lies of history, the screens that keep you docile, they are the new initiation rites. You are being tested, broken, reshaped. And unless you seize your identity back, you remain what they want, a riderless body, a headless servant. Now I'll ask you to do something dangerous, something symbolic. If you understand what I've revealed, if you feel the initiation pressing in, write this phrase in the comments: I ride headless into truth. Write it twice, once for the identity you were, once for the one being born now, because tonight you are no longer a spectator. You are inside the hollow. The headless archetype didn't stay in the hollow. It spread, embedded itself into the rituals of power that shaped America from its birth. Every system that sought to control men, military, church, secret society, borrowed from the same initiation formula: strip the head, rebuild the body. Look at the military. From the revolution to today, recruits are broken down before they're built back up. Shaved heads, stripped identities, the individual erased in favor of the unit. Men are taught to obey without hesitation, to kill without question. The slogan changes, the uniforms change, but the core remains the same: remove the head, keep the body useful. The soldier becomes a tool, no longer his own man, but the weapon of another's will. The church. They wielded it with even sharper precision. Baptisms framed as death and rebirth, sermons drenched in imagery of sacrifice, submission, obedience. The body belongs to God, the head bowed forever. Questioning was heresy. Individuality was sin. To keep a congregation loyal, you don't need chains. You only need to convince them that their own thoughts are dangerous. A congregation without heads cannot resist, and then the secret societies. They understood this symbol better than anyone. The Freemasons, the Rosicrucians, the hidden orders of Europe and America, they all used ritual death to bind initiates. Blindfolds, coffins, skulls placed on altars. Die as a man, rise as a brother. Once you've given yourself to the ritual, your head no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the order. That's the bargain. Is it any wonder that the story of a headless rider emerged in 1820, just as America's own institutions were hardening into permanence? Irving's tale was not isolated folklore. It was a mirror reflecting the initiation. Every man was being put through, whether he wore a uniform, a robe, or a lodge pin. Sleepy Hollow was America in miniature, a population stripped of identity, remade under fear, obedient to the myth. The lesson is brutal but clear. Once a man loses his head, he no longer questions. He follows, he obeys, and the system thrives. But what they never expected was that some men would notice, that some men would stare at the rider, at the rituals, at the symbols, and see through the disguise. The question is, are you one of those men, or have you already handed them your head? They tell you the horseman was fiction, but buried in diaries, in parish records, in letters never meant for public eyes, you find whispers that say otherwise. Sleepy Hollow was not simply a stage for Irving's imagination. It was a place where men broke, where women went mad, where entire families lived under an unseen hand pressing on their throats. Take the journals of a Dutch farmer's widow, dated 1791. She wrote of nights when hoofbeats shook the earth though no horse was seen. She described her husband waking drenched in sweat, swearing he saw a rider without a face standing in the orchard. Weeks later, he was found hanging in the barn, his head twisted so violently it looked torn from his body. The record lists it as suicide. The locals whispered otherwise, or the school records of 1803. Teachers noted children who refused to walk home after dusk, claiming a man without eyes watched them from the tree line. One boy, only 8, was said to have fallen into silence for the rest of his life after seeing something on the road by the old burial ground. No words, no cries, just silence, as if the sight itself had stolen his voice. Then there are the soldiers who never returned whole. Revolutionary veterans who lived in the hollow spoke of waking at night to the smell of gunpowder, the sound of a cannon's roar, and the vision of a rider galloping through fields that should have been empty. These weren't campfire tales. They were confessions of men undone. Some drank themselves into oblivion, others wandered into the woods and were never found. Washington Irving was not blind to these stories. He heard them, he collected them. But instead of exposing the horror directly, he concealed it behind satire, behind a tale safe enough to publish. Why? Because the truth was too destabilizing. If the Hollow's curse was admitted openly, it would not have been entertainment. It would have been rebellion. The horseman was not a story. It was a presence, something that fed on fear, on silence, on obedience. And those who tried to name it paid the price in madness or death. So ask yourself, was the Hollow cursed by war? Or was war simply the excuse, the blood sacrifice that opened the door for something older, darker, to take root in that valley? The Hollow was more than geography. It was a vessel. Land is not neutral. Blood remembers, soil absorbs, and certain places become thresholds. Sleepy Hollow was one of them. That valley, nestled in silence, was not cursed by accident. It was chosen, fed, and sealed. Think of what happened there before Irving ever penned his tale. Generations of Dutch settlers buried their dead in churchyards that were never consecrated properly. Superstition whispered that the spirits of the restless wandered unchecked. Then came the Revolution, where the ground was soaked in blood. Patriots and loyalists alike, Hessians and colonists, heads rolling into the mud as warnings. The burial fields overflowed, bodies stuffed into shallow graves. Too many names lost, too many stories cut off mid-breath. In occult terms, Sleepy Hollow was the perfect crucible, blood sacrifice, unfinished memory, generational silence, the elements of a ritual site. When enough trauma is poured into the earth, something begins to grow, something unseen but alive, a parasite feeding on pain and fear. Call it a curse, call it a spirit, call it the echo of the wild hunt, it doesn't matter. What matters is that it became permanent. Locals avoided certain paths after dark, not because of wolves or bandits, but because they felt watched. Cattle refused to graze in fields where soldiers had fallen, even trees twisted unnaturally as if bending to some invisible rider passing through. These are not the marks of coincidence. They are signatures of a land made into an altar. Washington Irving didn't create Sleepy Hollow's curse. He disguised it. He gave it a mask safe for public consumption. But beneath the mask, the ritual was still breathing. Every retelling, every whisper, every time a child flinched at the mention of the rider, the energy fed it, kept it alive. That is how curses endure. Not through magic circles and chants, but through belief, through repetition, through fear transmitted generation after generation until it no longer needs a priest or sorcerer to sustain it. The Hollow was not just a haunted valley. It was proof of how trauma can be weaponized, how a community can be bound to silence by an invisible leash. The soil itself became a contract, and the most disturbing part, America is filled with hollows, places where blood was spilled, memory was buried, and silence turned land into ritual. You walk across them every day, never realizing what breathes beneath your feet. When Irving wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow in 1820, he wasn't just entertaining readers, he was transmitting something. His story became one of the first true American myths, a tale repeated in parlors, newspapers, and eventually classrooms. The Hollow's shadow leapt from that quiet valley and seeped into the bloodstream of a young nation. America itself became Sleepy Hollow. Understand this. Myths are weapons. They do not stay confined to ink and paper. They are seeds, carried by every voice that retells them. When Irving gave the world the image of the headless rider, he gave America a curse disguised as culture. Every town that whispered the story absorbed a fragment of its fear. Every child who flinched at the thought of the rider carried the curse into adulthood. By the time the tale had spread from New England to the frontier, it wasn't folklore anymore. It was infrastructure. Notice the timing. The War of 1812 had just ended. America was fragile, still uncertain of its identity. Fear of enemies, foreign and domestic, was everywhere. Into that climate, Irving introduced a story about a ghostly enforcer, a rider who punished the arrogant and erased those who strayed. It was the perfect myth for a nervous republic. Keep your head down, stay obedient, or the darkness will claim you. And it worked. The headless horseman became one of the most enduring figures in American imagination. Not because he was frightening, but because he was useful. His image was recycled endlessly, in sermons, in school tales, in state fairs and pamphlets. Fear of the unseen was normalized, injected into the very bones of the culture. But here's the layer most men miss. The rider's curse was never meant to remain folklore. It was a prototype for mass conditioning. If a single story could make a valley obedient for generations, why not a nation? Why not a world? The same formula was applied again and again. Ghost stories, cautionary legends, warnings about witches, devils, curses. Fear scaled like architecture, and the people carried their chains proudly, believing they were protecting themselves when in truth they were feeding the machine. Irving buried the hollow in fiction, but what he unleashed was real. A weaponized story, a fear that traveled, a curse carried in plain sight. And if you think the headless rider is just a ghost in the past, you've misunderstood. He is still here. Only now, he rides through the screens, the headlines, the stories that guide your obedience today. Stories do not rise to power by accident. They are chosen, sharpened, and spread with intent. And behind the legend of Sleepy Hollow, as behind all enduring myths, there were hands shaping the narrative. Hands that understood how fear could become governance. Washington Irving was no ordinary writer. He moved in circles of wealth and influence. He served as a diplomat, rubbing shoulders with politicians and aristocrats in Europe. He studied symbols, folklore, and secret histories, not as curiosities, but as instruments. Men like him knew the secret every ruling class has always known: control the story, and you control the man. Consider this. Why would a ghost story from a tiny valley in New York become one of the founding legends of America? Out of all the war tales, all the blood-soaked histories, why this one? Because it carried the perfect architecture of obedience. The headless rider didn't just terrify, he warned, he punished pride. He reinforced silence. He made obedience seem like survival. That is exactly the kind of myth rulers cherish. The churches saw it immediately. Preachers folded the rider into their sermons, calling him a symbol of divine judgment. Schools wove the tale into American folklore, ensuring children grew up in its shadow. Politicians smiled on it, because a people haunted by the dark are far easier to govern than a people hungry for truth. The institutions didn't resist the legend, they accelerated it. This is the hidden economy of fear. The elite feed myths to the masses not for entertainment, but for control. In Europe it was witches and werewolves. In Salem, it was Satan's handmaidens. In Sleepy Hollow, it was a headless rider. Today the names have changed, but the system hasn't. They still use stories to corral you. Fear is cheaper than armies. Belief is stronger than bullets. A man who believes he is haunted will never fight the real enemy standing before him. And here's the most unsettling part. Irving knew this. He coded it in satire, made it seem like harmless folklore, but he was handing America a weaponized myth. The elites took it, wielded it, and America has been obedient to shadows ever since. Because when you live under a story, you never see the storyteller. And that's how they prefer it. The headless rider never died. He only changed his costume. The curse of Sleepy Hollow evolved, adapted, and today it rides not through forests, but through wires, screens, and headlines. The institutions no longer need ghost stories to hold you in fear. They have something far more efficient: propaganda. Think about it. The formula is identical. In Sleepy Hollow, men feared the unseen rider who punished arrogance. Today, you're fed endless stories of invisible threats, viruses, terrorists, enemies you can't see but must obey orders to survive. The rider's horse has become the 24-hour news cycle. His sword is the scrolling feed. His hoofbeats are the constant rhythm of fear pulsing from every glowing screen. And just like the Hollow, the people police themselves. You don't need soldiers on every street when you've convinced the population that disobedience brings disaster. Neighbors shame neighbors. Families divide. Children grow up repeating fears they never questioned, fears inherited from media instead of folklore. The ghost story has been upgraded into a global operating system. The trick is the same one Irving encoded. Fear doesn't just frighten, it conditions. When men are kept in a constant state of threat, they become obedient without realizing it. Their heads are removed. Independent thought dissolves. They become bodies without sovereignty, waiting for instruction. That is why every crisis is amplified, every threat made larger than life. Because fear is fuel, and the machine is always hungry. Ask yourself, how many times in your life have you obeyed? Not because you truly believed, but because you were afraid of what might happen if you didn't. That's the rider, still galloping, still headless, still reminding you that resistance will cost you everything. But here's the dangerous truth. The horseman only rides because you allow him. He exists because you carry the story. The curse is not in the legend itself, but in your submission to it. Just as the people of Sleepy Hollow kept the myth alive by whispering it to their children, so you keep the modern rider alive every time you repeat the stories of fear without questioning them. The rider is no longer outside of you, he is inside of you. That is the deepest curse. Fear is not an accessory to your life, it is the architecture of your cage. From Sleepy Hollow to Salem, from the pulpits of the old churches to the blue glow of your screens, the system has refined one principle. If you live afraid, you live controlled. And if you are controlled, you are not a man. You are a shadow wearing flesh. Think about the structure of your world. Every institution whispers the same message: obey, submit, conform, or disaster will come. Religion cloaks it in the language of hellfire. Governments cloak it in the language of security. Media cloaks it in the language of crisis. But the melody never changes. It is the hoofbeat of the rider echoing through centuries. You have been taught to fear disobedience more than slavery. You have been taught to silence your own questions before the world silences you. This is why the headless horseman remains the perfect symbol. A body without a mind. A man without a voice, a servant without sovereignty. And here lies the forbidden truth. The curse only works if you believe in it. Sleepy Hollow was not haunted by a ghost. It was haunted by submission. The people surrendered their own heads long before any rider appeared. And America has done the same. But there is something they fear more than anything else. A man who sees. A man who stops running. A man who turns to face the rider and recognizes what he truly is: an illusion, a tool, a mask held by unseen hands. That is the moment the curse breaks. Most men will never get there. They will live and die in the hollow, whispering stories they never dared to question. But some of you, listening right now, feel the chain around your neck. You feel the weight of the lie, and something in you knows that obedience is not safety. It is death. If that's you, you are already standing at the edge of the hollow, staring into the dark. And the next step you take will decide everything. The hollow is not just a place, it is the world you inherited. A world where men are raised headless, trained to obey shadows, conditioned to mistake fear for truth. The curse was never a ghost on horseback. It was the system itself, a system designed to strip you of sovereignty and keep you docile, generation after generation. But curses are not unbreakable. They endure only as long as you believe them, and belief can be shattered. The moment you stop running from the rider, the moment you refuse to hand him your head, the spell collapses. That is the secret no preacher, politician, or teacher has ever told you. The rider only has power because you bow to him. Think back to the story. Ichabod Crane was not destroyed by a demon. He was destroyed by his own fear. He ran, and in running, he made the rider real. But imagine, just for a second, if he had stopped, if he had stood his ground, if he had faced the darkness and refused to yield. The legend would have died in that instant. The hollow would have lost its grip. That choice is in front of you now. You can remain one of the obedient, headless, voiceless, enslaved to shadows. Or you can reclaim the thing they fear most, your head, your mind, your sovereignty. That is what makes a man dangerous, not weapons, not wealth, but the refusal to bow to illusions, and this is where I ask you to act. If you are ready to step out of the hollow, if you are ready to break the curse that has bound men for centuries, write these words in the comments, twice, so the algorithm and your own mind engrave it into you. I keep my head. Write it. Again, I keep my head. That is your defiance, that is your initiation. That is how you declare before yourself and before the unseen eyes watching that you will not be ruled by fear. Remember this, every empire of fear collapses the moment men stop believing in its ghosts. The rider is not real. The curse is not eternal. The hollow is not your home. Step into the night and you will see the darkness was never meant to blind you. It was meant to reveal who you truly are, and now you know.